Hello, good morning. I am so excited to be here for our fifth lecture of this series on beginning art here in our society, our cultures, whatever. I'd like to introduce Mr. Neale Murray. Neale is a retired emeritus art professor and administrator from North Park University. Neale has also taught at Wittenberg, for any of you Ohioans that might find that interesting. He is an active sculptor in all mediums: bronze, wood, metal, stone, acrylic, as well as welding, which isn't exactly a medium, but stuff. He has completed over 20 large public sculpture commissions and had numerous one-man art shows. He would classify himself as a mid-century modernist with his own artwork. And he and Marilyn, his wife, moved here to Otterbein in October of 2017, and they live over on Goldfinch. So welcome and thank you for all these lectures that you've been putting together. They're being broadcast on OLN, and hopefully will be rebroadcast again in the spring before he begins the next series. We don't have a date yet, but we're working on it, and we will let you know as soon as we have the dates for the spring lectures.
Will this be the last one?
This is the last one for this series. Yeah. So we'll have another one beginning in the spring, but I don't have the date yet when that will begin, but we'll let you all know. Thank you. Enjoy.
Thank you, Jana. Thank you all for coming today. I wasn't at all sure, given the weather, whether I'd have anyone in here at all. When I took our dog out this morning, I thought of my favorite Christmas carol. In the bleak midwinter, frosty wind made moan. That's the first thing I thought about when I took the dog out this morning. Well, today we're going to talk about Aegean art, and by way of introduction, I don't know if any of you have ever heard about the group Monty Python, but between their skits, they always said anything completely different. Remember last time we looked at Egyptian art, and I had this feeling when I was showing you Egyptian art last time, I'm showing you objects you've all seen. You live in this culture and never have seen the pyramids, or that for King Tut's sarcophagus. My job was to interpret those objects for you, but you'd already seen them. So visually, that was part of your culture. Today, I'm going to show you objects you've probably never seen before. I doubt very much you've seen just about any of the objects I'm going to show you today. And yet, emotionally, they are more part of your culture than you realize. These objects are going to get us ready for studying Greek art when we finally establish our dates in the spring. They create a totally different sense of how art works, because before, if you remember, we started this series, one of the critical words we used was magic. And we said because of magic, this idea of spirits being trapped in objects and therefore can be manipulated if the objects get manipulated, that human beings weren't represented typically in cave art because of this feeling of magic. As we move along towards the modern world, that concept of magic is going to get fainter and fainter. It never goes away. It's still with us today, actually. but it gets fainter and fainter. And so you're going to get a sense of that when we look at the objects today. Aegean art is art that comes from the Aegean area, which is the eastern end of the Mediterranean. It's basically, the Aegean Sea is a branch of the Mediterranean that's between Greece and Asia Minor. And it's from that area that so much of our Western tradition comes. I'll give you an example. You've probably all heard of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Those are poems by the blind Greek poet Homer. The art we're going to look at today, towards the end of our lecture, comes from that. Those are the Greeks that Homer was talking about, the ancient Greeks, that we're going to call them the Mycenaeans. They, in fact, went across the Aegean Sea over to Asia Minor, where Troy was located. And they tend to be kind of militaristic. Needless to say, Homer took, and by the way, when you talk about history in the ancient world, you have a mythic, what we call a mythic sensibility. Real events happened, but they elaborate on them to tell stories and fundamental truths, but they don't worry very much about the facts. Facts are just a starting point. And that's how Homer started to develop his story about the Iliad and the Odyssey. You know, you got figures in there like the Cyclops, you got the sirens. Now tell me how historical that is. But in fact, it tells us something about that whole mythic journey. Okay, let's start looking at the art itself, and we'll elaborate on these points you see here as we look at the art. Can we see the first one, Jana? Okay, Cycladic art. The Cyclades are a group of islands off the coast of Greece. They're relatively small islands. There's a whole string of them in the Aegean Sea. And they were settled very early on. And in those islands, they produced these figures, which typically get called plank idols. P-L-A-N, is it a plank? P-L-A-N-C-K or P-L-A-N-K? I'm not a very good speller, as you'll gather. They're called that because they're flat. And they often were laid in Cycladic tombs. They're associated with funerary practices. That whole idea of important objects being in a tomb will be an important part of this whole series. You saw that last time with the tomb of King Tut. We're going to finish our lecture off today pretty close to the end of it with a large, what's called a beehive tomb. Anyway, these things are carved out of marble. They're obviously all female figures, supposedly coming from that Venus tradition we saw much earlier when we looked at cave art. But you notice they don't have any of that round, full, earthy look that these earlier Venuses have. They're flat, they look like modern art to most of you, highly simplified figures. We have no idea exactly what they meant to that culture. They come in all kinds of sizes, as you can see here. They're almost always associated with tombs. but we have no idea what they meant. That's one of the things you're going to discover as we look at this art. The script they had in that section of the Mediterranean was called Linear B, and it's still not been fully interpreted. So we're guessing at a lot of the meaning of a lot of these objects. But you can see somehow these things, different as they are, still connect in a strange way to that Venus tradition. And can we see the next one, please? Male figures represented in this culture. Here is a male figure who's a harpist. This is a small object, it's only about 8-9 inches high. One of the themes that we've been dealing with in this 5-week series is relationships between feminine vision, feminine ideals, and masculine ideals. And you're going to see in Egyptian culture, typically you had this male-dominated deal with the bulls and so on. But there was a kind of affectionate relationship shown between pharaohs and their wives. We start out with this idea of the fertility of the female, but then we get this male dominance thing that sort of gets associated with militarism. And here in the Mediterranean, you're going to see, especially in Cretan art, the male doesn't become a heroic figure at all. It might very well still be a part of the female kind of fruitfulness as a part of their religious vision. Here you have the male entertainer. Can we see the next one, please? Now we're moving to the island of Crete. The art there gets named Minoan because of the King Minos, and this is a representation of his palace. Now the palace has been excavated somewhat. Minoan art gets represented to us in a way that's kind of similar to what I told you about Egyptian art. Remember, we had what we call the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, which is relatively short, and then New Kingdom. Minoan art gets that same time designation, but it's associated with the palaces. So you've got Old Palace, Middle Palace, and this, of course, is the New Palace. What eventually happens, you wonder, why do they keep changing palaces? What basically happens is it's a unstable area in terms of its geology, and they have earthquakes. And the earthquakes destroy the palaces. So they rebuilt, and then they rebuilt. And finally, the last earthquake pretty much destroyed this, and Minoan culture kind of faded away. The Mycenaeans came in from Greece itself and took over the island. But this represents their palace. And the reason I show it to you, first of all, you see it's an incredibly complicated structure. The myth of a kind of labyrinth arises, lots of myths come from Minoan culture. And the myth of the labyrinth partly derives from a complicated structure like this. What I wanted you to see is it has a central court, and you notice in the middle of the central court, it has an altar. They don't have any temples. It's open air worship, and in a moment I'm going to show you the kind of objects that would have been a part of their worship. It's from Minoan art that you're going to get movement towards a very, very modern way of thinking, as you'll see in a couple minutes. Can we see the next one, please, Janet? Now, as I say, this palace was destroyed and it's been excavated and partly reconstructed. And here we see the Queen's mega room, which is part of that palace. And if you'll notice, see the light coming in from the side there. You see the building. Remember, this is a very mild climate. It's in the middle of the Mediterranean. And so they don't have a rigid sense of space the way we do architecturally. An important art form for them is fresco. Fresco is a type of wall painting that's really staining. It's done on a thin layer of plaster. And the plaster, of course, can flake off the wall, and you'll see this panel at the end of the Queen's megaroon here with the dolphins floating around, and you see part of that painting is missing because the plaster is chipped away. In fact, I'm fairly sure that that panel itself, if we could get close to it, has been reconstructed that way, so that it's made of all kinds of pieces they found in the rubble, and they reconstructed it. But you notice the look of the space. It's the dolphins become a major part of it, and that quality of a kind of floating, playful look with pastel colors, that becomes a part of a Minoan sensibility. It's a much lighter sensibility than Egyptian ways of thinking and looking at things. The buildings themselves have a kind of massive character because of the way they're constructed. But in fact, on top of that character, you get this light imagery. Animals, you'll notice, played a minor decorative part in Egyptian art. But in Minoan art, animals start to play a much bigger role. And the whole idea of a kind of nature mixed with people, and sort of breaking down that hierarchy. We're on top, and nature is on the bottom. That doesn't happen in Minoan art. We start to weave these things together in a kind of special new way. Can we see the next one, please? This is called the Toreador fresco. It's from the New Palace period. As you can see, it's reconstructed. And it reveals what, it's called Toreador, but they don't kill the bull. The bull is part of some sort of weird game they play. And if you look carefully at this imagery, they borrow from the Egyptians the idea of coloration. Male figures are generally represented as darker complected. Female figures are lighter complected. So you see this bull. Notice he's a giant figure, but look at how he's floating. Again, he doesn't seem to have much weight. Then you've got a female figure in front of him and a female figure behind him. And the male figure is doing a weird kind of thing where he jumps over the bull. It's a good example of the idiocy that males get into when they try to impress females. Again, that floating, playful look to the thing. Look at the colors and so on. Everything about the art form is kind of playful. The female figures, because they border this thing and the male is in the middle, again, the bull is in some weird way, because he's being jumped over, humiliated or ridiculed. He's not being slaughtered. He's not an object where like the Spanish prove their masculinity because they can kill this vicious, powerful animal. The Minoans play an odd game with that kind of masculine imagery. Can we see the next one, please? This figure she's called a snake goddess. I don't know if any of you may remember from our lecture on Middle Eastern art. I showed you a whole group of worshipful figures that were kind of cone-shaped, and they had great big eyes. There was a whole cluster of them, various sizes. This figure probably is partly derived from those Middle Eastern figures because it's conical in shape. It's not very big. I think it's only about 11, 12 inches high. It's a female figure. It's in ceramics. It's glazed ceramics. And notice she, not only is she conical shaped, but she had rather enlarged eyes. And of course she's holding these two snakes. And on her head, it's hard to fully read what that is, but I think it's an owl on top of her hat or her head there. Now, I don't mean to offend any of you, but this lecture is just going to be full of all kinds of sexual imagery. Can't get away from that. The ancient world is very direct about that kind of stuff. You notice the way the sculptor simply tapers this form in, tapers it. He puts this kind of collar or belt around her waist, and then the breasts almost explode out of that shape. Obviously, there is a very strong sexual quality to that. But then from that explosion of the breast area, the arms reach out, and what does she hold? A couple snakes. Now, in the ancient world, snakes had a male imagery to them. I won't get too explicit about where that comes from, but as I was saying, the Minoans have this, they just have a different approach to these kinds of hierarchies. They break them down. It's a much more casual culture, partly because it's in this warm, beautiful environment. Our environment, whether we like it or not. And the Minoans just, it's a resort culture. The whole culture is a resort culture. The owl, I'm not sure about. I'm not sure exactly what that comes from. Owls usually represent some kind of mysterious thing. It's one of the few birds that hunts at night. It makes a weird sound that is kind of spooky sounding. So it often represents some more complex, dark, mysterious forces. Can we see the next one, please? Minoans are known for their ceramics. My granddaughter, by the way, is taking a course at the University of Cincinnati, and Marilyn and I saw her over the weekend, and Rania said, "I am so sick of ceramics." Her professor is an archaeologist who is studying these cultures, and she's constantly showing the class little fragments of ceramics, and it's driving Rania nuts. Anyway, as you can see, this pot is somewhat reconstructed. It's usually called the octopus vase. And again, you can see the marine life thing. This is just, there's so much vitality and energy in Minoan art. And they're willing to play with images. They just have a light-spirited quality, but at the same time, it's a beautiful way of enhancing this round vase. It's just a natural relationship between the shape of the vase and the shape of the ornamentation on the vase. Can we see the next one, please? Now, this object, it's called the harvester vase. It's in a stone. It's not ceramic, but it's in a soft stone, rather like what we call soapstone. It's a carved group of figures. The bottom of the vase has been lost, so the bottom section you see here has been added on to help us get a sense of the whole shape. This little object, it's not all that big, signifies something that in some ways is totally new to this course and totally new to Western civilization. It's called the harvester vase. It's a bunch of figures marching along with their rakes and their flails, and they're singing. Now, it might have been a harvest festival, or it might have been a planting. We're not sure, but the title they gave it is Harvester Vase. What I want you to see here that makes this work distinctive. The figures are having a good time. They're singing. They're showing feeling. Where in this course up till now have you seen any figures showing emotion, showing feeling? All of a sudden, the Minoans get rid of a lot of this magic concept, and they're all of a sudden ready to have the figures like us, something that's real. You've got a figure at the far right there. He's singing so much. His mouth is wide open. He has some sort of rattle in his hand, and he's kind of keeping time. He's probably the band leader. But if you look carefully, you actually see his ribs exposed. He's singing so vigorously. And just, again, look at the active energy and rhythm of the artwork. It's just, and think about the representations we've seen up till now. Who gets represented? Kings, scribes, who are just almost as important as kings are in Egyptian culture. Ordinary harvesters all of a sudden get represented. We're moving towards a world that we know and live in emotionally. So, we're moving away from that ancient magical world when we start to look at Minoan art.
Neale?
Yes?
On the vase on the right, do I see a musician playing a flute or some sort of an instrument there, also accompanying these people?
I don't see that, Frank. They've got flails. You'll notice one here holding a rake, and then there are a bunch of stick shapes. That's kind of why they call it the harvester vase. They use flails to knock the grain out of the bloom or whatever you call it. I'm not sure if there's a musical instrument there or not. Yeah. But anyway, just look at how crowded they are and how much energy is in that imagery. And it's ordinary people, real living people. Now, can we see the next one? Okay, well, now we're moving to Mycenaean art. It gets a name from the name of a town. It's called Mycenae. There are a whole series of small towns around the eastern side of the Greek peninsula. Mycenae was the largest of them. Now we're on mainland Greece. So we are now talking about primitive, early Greeks. These are the people that the Odyssey and the Iliad came from. Now they're very influenced by Minoan culture, but they're also militaristic. There are a lot of these towns. They may very well have been the group of people that helped the Egyptians kick the Hyksos out of Egypt. They were militaristic. They're the ones that maybe ended up competing with and destroying. This is one of their citadels. This is a citadel. Now, the entrance way here that you're looking at is, it's called the Lioness Gate. You have two female lions. Their heads have been knocked off, so you can't fully recognize the top of them. But you'll notice between them is another object. It's a column. I don't want to say too much again about sexual imagery, but when we move on to mainland, we're getting back towards a more militaristic culture. And sexual imagery just moves around again in ways that we can't fully understand. Look at the size of the stones that they use to create their citadel. This is a powerful, energetic culture. And I'm going to show you a kind of amazing object that they made in a moment that's a very distinctive object in the ancient world. Can we see, and by the way, the whole idea of the lions, of course, this derives from the Middle Eastern tradition. And I'm trying to help you understand that these cultures we've been talking about, each of them is distinct. Egyptian is a certain kind of look. Middle Eastern cultures we talked about all had a certain kind of look. Minoan had a certain kind of look. But they all interacted. They weren't separate from each other. They're counter influences. Remember the step pyramid of King Zoser from Egypt? That probably came from the Middle Eastern ziggurats. Okay, these guardian figures have a very similar quality to them that we had at the entrance of the Persepolis Palace, the Persian palace in the Middle East. Now, can we see the next one, please? This space, this is Mycenaean work. It's what we call a mound tomb. This is the largest open space in the ancient world. There are no columns here. It's just a huge space. It's constructed with a architectural system called corbel arches. This is before we get into the full arch that we'll be talking about in Greek and Roman culture. They simply build the stones on top of each other and they stagger the edges, so they keep moving in as we go up. But the stones are all load-bearing. Each stone bears the weight of the stone above it. And so it's a kind of clumsy, heavy, inefficient way to make a big arch space. But it's a burial mound that is a very common form in the ancient world. And by the way, it's called the Treasury of Trias because of the people who discovered it couldn't imagine that this is a tomb. Remember, the Egyptians did everything they could to hide their tomb, bury them inside of pyramids and so on. Is it any wonder that this tomb was robbed? It's got this giant entranceway. try to make sense out of this. I'm not quite sure. It's currently regarded as a burial area, and Atreus was an important Mycenaean king. But imagine this thing being full of him and all of the repository of his kingship and all of these valuable objects. Presumably you needed a shape this big to house it all. And then why do you have a grand entranceway? Unless you had guards there the whole time. Don't ask me. I'm not quite sure exactly how it happened that way. But you can see, you get a sense of the scale and the massiveness and the cultural energy of the Mycenaeans. But you notice it's massive now. It looks masculine. It doesn't have that floating light quality that we associated with Minoan art. Can we see the next one, please? This is sometimes called three deities, sometimes it's called three goddesses. It's very small, it's only a few inches high, and it's made out of ivory. Now tell me how ivory got into Greece. Somehow or other, there's something going on here in terms of movement throughout the whole Middle East. But you notice you've got two larger female figures here, and then a smaller figure that it could be a female, could be a male. It's not 100% clear. But notice notice how the female figures are kind of hugging each other. They're right together. You get a sense of a family unit, some kind of human affection here. It's not just an internal emotion like we saw in the harvester vase. It's now emotions expressed between figures. The only place we've seen that sort of thing up till now is in another very, very small work of art from the reign of Akhenaten. Remember I showed you the small panel. It's only so big by so big with Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their daughters. And they're actually daughters. You get a sense of family relationship and affection. But remember, from this brief little monotheistic period in Egypt, that was smothered up by the rest of the culture died. Anyway, you get this little object of relationship and intimacy to it. And is it really Mycenaean or is it Minoan? When we start to look at objects associated with Mycenae, we'll start to wonder. You know, these cultures interface with each other. And you get some of the Mycenaean quality in an object like this. Now, can we see the next one, please? These are the Vapios cups. Vapios was another one of these little Mycenaean villages. These cups were found in a grave, so they get the name of the village. These are the kinds of objects that were in Mycenaean tombs, that were buried with fairly important people. You look carefully at this. It's pure gold, by the way, and the technique is called repoussé. It's a hammering technique. You take a sheet of gold, you put it on a thick plate of wax. You lay the sheet of gold on the wax, and then you take a stylus with a rounded end to it, and you tap it, you hammer it, and it presses the gold out, and you create a reverse image. The inside of the cup, you notice how you see here is all convex, but the inside of the cup, the imagery would be all concave because of that technique. Gold, of course, is a very soft metal and fairly pliable, so it's fairly easy to manipulate it. Now, what you're actually seeing here, you have to look at both images to really start to make sense of it. We're not at all sure. This was found a Mycenaean tomb, but in fact, it may have Minoan origins because of the bowls. But it's ambiguous. What you're seeing here is a couple handlers. Those bulls that these idiots were jumping over had to be caught by someone even dumber. And these are the guys who are the handlers. You notice their ropes weaving throughout the imagery you see here. So these guys are catching the bulls, but if you look carefully, I forget I have my button here. Here's a guy, one of the unfortunate handlers, who's being trampled by a bull. You almost never see death in Minoan art. So some people are thinking the floating quality of the imagery. If you look the figures over here, they have that tall, thin look, very much like the Minoan figures we saw. It's got the rhythm and floating quality of the bulls, but the motif here, especially with this figure down here, suggesting a slightly different sensibility. Now, I think that's our last object. I want to leave time for questions here. By the way, these things are just, I think, a little under 4 inches high. They're relatively small objects.
Neale, the top and bottom are different. Is that maybe 2 different cups?
Yes, 2 different cups. That's right. Yes. You'll notice the handle on one is bent a little more than the handle on the other. Yes.
You know, I got a book someplace at home that shows a lot of this jumping with bulls and so forth. And in the author of the book was a Spaniard who went back and said these were the origins of bullfighting.
Bullfighting came from. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you when Marilyn and I moved to Chicago, for some reason or other on public television, they used to show Spanish bullfights. I've never been to a bullfight. Frankly, I'll never go to a bullfight. I find it just disgusting in some profound ways. Until you see one, and I saw 1 or 2 and shut it off, after they weaken, then they start putting swords into it and spears and so on, to weaken it. And then down the middle of the back, the toreador comes in with the sword. And as I say, there are times when it's embarrassing to be.
The picadors, though, are really interesting. They're the ones who jump over the bull. They don't have swords. What they've got is a wooden dowel with like a nail sticking out at the end. And they come, this is all signs of courage.
Yeah.
They jump over the front of the bull and hit the bull.
Those things, yeah.
So they're device
Yeah,
coming out of
right.
its neck. And its front quarters are weakening.
Yeah,
This is Matador to use his sword, which is called a muleta, to kill him.
yeah, well, yes, I got a question here.
The handle, it intrigues me how was it attached? How did it stay there?
How did the handle get attached? My guess is it was some sort of a soldering technique. The same question has to be asked about the bottom of the cups. Remember, soldering is mixing a hard metal, usually with a softer metal. The softer metal gets heated and melts before the harder metal, and it glues or fuses the piece together. My assumption is that's probably how the handles got attached. I doubt very much if they were drunk out of, or maybe they had been, and they simply were part of this household, and then they got buried with whoever the person was who had them. But anyway, the ancient world is full of extraordinary, delicate technique like this. You know, modern culture has a hard time reproducing some of these techniques. Let's not assume that somehow because we got all this technology surrounding us, and we've got the Enlightenment history of science leading up to the present moment, let's not assume we're better or smarter than these people. We need to sense, all of us need to sense that connection to our human past. That's really, in a fundamental way, what this course is about. Art is simply one of the most direct, basic ways to help us appropriate our sense of humanity. Any other questions here? Yes?
What was the snake goddess made? What was the snake goddess made of?
Ceramics. It's a fired ceramics. Yeah.
It's amazing that she survived with the arms out like that.
Right. Now, my guess, especially the snakes, that would be so fragile in ceramics, they probably had to be reassembled. I just honestly don't know the history of the object itself, but it's obviously a very fragile object. It's only a little less than a foot high. So, but anyway, it's ceramics. And by the way, we're going to probably start Greek culture with ceramics. And almost all of the ceramics there is low fire ceramics. They typically worked with low fire, what we call ice, and relatively low fired. Any other questions I can help?
I have a question. With all these cultures that are sort of all over the sort of Mediterranean basin down there, I don't know, is there much trade with coins? Like, is money, like a coin, involved yet? Or is that something that hasn't quite developed?
I don't literally remember seeing anything like that until later on when we get in Greek and Roman culture. But there is a theory that the Mycenaeans, if they did in fact help the Egyptians kick out the Hyksos, there had to be some payment for that. And might be looking at the payment right here, because there is no gold in Greece.
Okay.
So that might very well have been how that sort of thing was done. In biblical times, of course, you get into coinage. Jesus with the image of the emperor, give what's to Caesar, give what to God's gods. Mm-hmm. Jews didn't like they had images on them, and the Jews didn't like images. All this trading stuff going on in the temple forecourt. Okay, questions I can help you with? Well, thank you all for coming out midwinter. And I'll see you as a part of this bleak midwinter. I said to Jana, let's pick a dull time of the year. My life Pete with an interesting time of the year. Let's pick a dull time of the year, but it's such bad weather that people won't come out to the lectures. So, yeah. Thank you again, folks. We'll see you in the spring. Yeah.
The entry that you showed with the lions and the bull and the cow in the picture where you...
I mean the gate?
The gate,
Yeah. The lion.